We've had the inflation for years. The Fed has been creating inflation. They just call it quantitative easing, but what they're really doing is creating inflation. What finally happened recently is that all that inflation showed up in a very big way in consumer prices. I mean, it was there before, it just wasn't as obvious because the increases weren't as big, and the government did its best to cover them up with a highly rigged CPI that has been understating the rate at which prices have been rising for years. And by the way, we are in double-digit price increases if we accurately measured those increases. It's only because of the inaccurate measurement that we're using, the CPI, that we're still under 10%. But if we measured prices today the way we measured them back in the 80s, because we often want to compare today's inflation to the 80s and 70s, it's actually north of 15%. It's actually worse than any year of the 1970s.
I spoke to an economist about that, Steve Hanke, actually. I asked him, why is it that people are complaining about the government's underreporting inflation? This is his answer. I want you to comment on that. He says, maybe we're just outliers. Maybe our spending patterns are different from the average Joe's. And so what we notice is an increase in double digits of whatever we usually consume. Maybe you and I, Peter, just have an expensive lifestyle is basically his answer. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, it's just that the government statisticians live in a fantasy world, and the average American lives in reality. But no, the answer to the question is we deliberately changed the CPI. I mean, nobody pays owner's equivalent rent. So why does the government use a number that no American pays as the largest component of the CPI? Why not use actual rent, the rent that people pay? Because that number is triple or quadruple this number that the government has concocted. Or why not use house prices that are actually going up more than rents? Because people actually buy houses and they have to pay those prices. And they've made other changes to the CPI that did not exist prior, all the substitution where the basket is not the same, but it constantly changes. They take out the stuff that went up and they put stuff in that went down or didn't go up as much. And they have ways of hedonically adjusting things. So they claim that prices didn't go up when they did, or claim that prices went down when they went up, because they're making a subjective assessment of quality. But oftentimes I think they reduce prices when quality goes up, but they don't increase them when quality goes down.
So you have an issue with the components of the CPI. Okay, that's understandable. So why do you think they're doing that? Let's assume you're right and they're underreporting what inflation should be. Do you think there's maybe a political incentive to underreport CPI?
Well, of course. You know, I mean, my dad used to say trusting the government to give you accurate information on inflation is like trusting the mafia to give you accurate information on crime.
Was your dad Russian? Did he live in Russia?
Actually, his parents were from there, but he was born in the United States. But the point is, look, the government has every reason to understate inflation. In fact, when they first did it, it had to do with the budget. They were trying to reduce spending on Social Security and Medicare, but no politician had the guts to actually reduce Social Security or Medicare. So they found a way to reduce the COLAs so that they wouldn't be increasing them by the true rate of inflation. And so they changed the methodology for calculating inflation. So it enabled the government to cut spending without officially voting to cut spending. So that's how it started. But you know, it delivers all sorts of benefits to the government, because by understating inflation, you also overstate growth. Because whenever they take the GDP numbers, they use an inflation rate to deflate it, the GDP deflator, because they want to show what's happening to the real economy and take inflation out. And so when you pretend that inflation is lower than it actually is, it makes it appear that the economy is growing faster than it actually is. And all politicians want to take credit for economic growth. And so by lying about inflation and underreporting it, they can pretend the economy is much stronger than it actually is. But more recently, it's the Federal Reserve that's been able to hide behind these doctored inflation figures as a pretense to continue its reckless monetary policy. The Fed has been able to justify 0% interest rates in QE on the basis of inflation still being below their 2% target, which, first of all, 2% was never a target. It was supposed to be a ceiling. It wasn't like if inflation was 1%, they had to get it up to 2%, but they turned the ceiling into a target in order to pursue an inflationary monetary policy. But inflation was never too low. That was just a canard. That was just a false excuse for the Fed to do what it wanted to do, which was to prop up government spending, to continue to blow air into a bubble, to artificially push up stock prices and real estate prices. But it didn't want to admit that was its goal. So it came up with this ridiculous goal of that there not being enough inflation and trying to raise the inflation rate. Well, all the years the Fed was pretending this was their goal, I was warning what was going to happen when they overshot. Because eventually I said the official numbers would be much, much higher than 2%. And then the Fed would be in a box because it would be impossible to ever bring the rate of inflation back down to 2% without completely destroying the bubble economy that low interest rates and QE had inflated.
We're going to come back to how they're going to fix this problem if there is a solution. But first, let's talk about the root causes of this problem that we're in. Now, you talked about how asset prices have moved up first before CPI, and that was correct. And you've talked about how monetary policy, the failed monetary policies of the Fed, have created this problem. Let me ask you this, Peter. QE is not a new phenomenon. We've had QE before in the early 2000s. Why didn't we have higher CPI back then? Why did it happen only this time around?
Well, first of all, I think we did have higher inflation back then. And in fact, had the government not done QE, we may have actually had falling prices in 2009 or 2010. It was the Great Recession, so prices probably should have come down. But because of all the inflation we created, they went up instead. And of course, they went up by more than the government admits because we're still looking at the CPI. But the reason it's so much worse now than it was back then is because we've printed so much more money. Look at the enormity of the QE program subsequent to COVID. And, look at the number of dollars that have been put into circulation over the past couple of years. A lot of the QE that was done, following the financial crisis was mainly focused in the financial economy. So you saw a much bigger impact on asset prices like stocks and real estate. But this time around, the government sent all these checks directly to the people that they went and spent. In fact, the worst thing they did, and I pointed this out real time, is they told people not to go to work and to stay home. In fact, in many cases, people were ordered not to work and to stay home. So people couldn't produce goods, they couldn't produce services. Their spending should have gone down because they weren't producing as much, so they should have spent less. And that would have meant a recession, of course, but the politicians didn't want that. So they told the workers who were taking a vacation, we're gonna send you money. In fact, we're gonna give you more money than you used to earn when you had a job, even though you're staying at home, and we want you to go out and spend that money. Well, spend it on what? Nobody was making anything. So when you make less stuff, but you print more money to buy stuff, prices have got nowhere to go but way up because the government didn't create any stuff. They just printed more money to buy stuff. And the other reason that the inflation was not as big is because we were able to export the inflation to our trading partners. We run these enormous trade deficits, which are now at all-time record highs. They've just blown through the roof as far as the size of these deficits. We take the money the Fed prints and we send it over to China, and the Chinese send us all the goods that they produce. And they take those dollars and they buy treasuries or things like that. But so that helps keep a lid on consumer prices, but it also helps reduce interest rates and prop up stock prices. So we've benefited from that, but I think that dynamic is going to change. I think a lot of the money we've exported is going to come back and prices are going to be bid up even faster.